Before there was even the idea of a beginning, there was something else. Something older. Something so vast and so still that the very concept of time had not yet learned to move. They had no temples, no worshippers, no myths told around evening fires, because evening itself had not yet been invented. They did not ask to be remembered. They simply were, and the universe arranged itself around them the way water arranges itself around stone. We call them the Primordials. They were not beings who ruled creation. They were the creation itself, wearing a face. In the oldest traditions of the ancient world, Greek, Sumerian, Egyptian, Mesopotamian, and beyond, the Primordials occupy a category so fundamental that even the greatest of gods bowed, at least in silence, to what they represented. These were not figures of myth in the familiar sense. They were not heroes. They did not quarrel over kingdoms or fall in love with mortals. They did not need to. They were the kingdom. They were the darkness before the torch, the abyss before the sea, the silence before the first word was ever spoken aloud. To understand the Primordials is to understand something deeply uncomfortable about the nature of existence itself. That beneath everything beautiful and ordered and named, there is a layer of reality that is none of those things. There is something ancient and immeasurable and boundless, and it was there long before beauty thought to exist. In the Greek tradition, the very first of these beings was chaos. Not chaos as we understand the word today, not noise or confusion or disorder, but the original gaping void. A breathless, yawning absence from which all things would eventually spill forth. From chaos came Gaia, the earth herself. Not a goddess of the earth, but the earth as a conscious, ancient, and terrifyingly patient being. From the same primordial source arose Tartarus, the deepest pit of existence, a place so far beneath the world that a bronze anvil dropped from heaven would fall for 9 full days before it reached the bottom. And with them came Eros, not love as romance, but love as the primal force that binds all things together, the fundamental magnetism at the heart of creation itself. These were the first 4, and they were only the beginning. Nyx, the goddess of night, was so ancient, so absolute in her power, that even Zeus, king of all the Olympians, feared to anger her. The ancient Greeks understood something that we, in our age of light and noise and speed, have largely forgotten, that the oldest forces are not the loudest ones. Nyx, the goddess of night, never raised an army. She never threw a thunderbolt. She simply spread her dark wings across the world each evening, and everything, man, beast, and god alike, grew quiet. The historian Hesiod tells us that even Zeus, thunderer, skyfather, king of all the Olympians, feared to anger her, not because she could destroy him, because she was older than the concept of destruction. Her night had fallen over worlds that no longer existed. This is what made the Primordials so terrifyingly compelling then and now. Their power was not the power of force or fire or divine wrath. It was the power of inevitability. You cannot fight the dark. You cannot outrun the abyss. You cannot reason with time. These were beings who did not threaten, they simply continued, and that was more than enough. Over the 5 chapters that follow, we will walk, slowly, carefully, reverently, through the world of these first ancient beings. We will meet them not as monsters, not as allegories, but as what the people of the ancient world genuinely believed them to be, the oldest truths wearing the oldest faces. We will sit with Erebus, the darkness that fills the spaces between stars. We will descend with Tartarus into depths that no map has ever charted. We will stand at the shore of Pontos, the primeval sea, and listen to what the water still remembers. There is no reason to rush. The Primordials have been waiting since before the world had a name for waiting. We have time, the nothing from which everything came. There is a question so old that the asking of it predates every language we have ever found, scratched into stone or pressed into wet clay. It is a question children still ask, usually at night, usually quietly, just before sleep. And it is the same question the ancient Greeks asked when they looked up at the stars and tried, with every instrument of the human mind, to answer it. The question is simply this: what was there before everything? The answer the Greeks gave was not nothing exactly. It was something closer to the idea of nothing. A vast, formless, breathless openness that existed before shape, before direction, before even the concept of empty space had been given room to mean anything. They called it chaos. And we must be careful here, because the word has done us a great disservice over the centuries. Chaos was not disorder. Chaos was the absence of order, which is an entirely different thing, and infinitely more profound. When we say chaos today, we picture noise, tumbling wreckage, a storm with no eye. But the ancient Greek chaos, from the verb chaino, meaning to gape, to yawn wide open, described something altogether more unsettling in its stillness. It was not a storm. It was the space before the storm had anywhere to blow. It was an infinite, silent yawning, a gap so complete that it did not even contain the darkness, because darkness too had not yet arrived to fill it. Hesiod, writing in his Theogony around the 8th century before the Common Era, placed chaos at the very beginning of his cosmological account. Before Earth, before Tartarus, before Eros, before anything that could be pointed to or named. He did not describe what chaos looked like, because there was nothing to look with and nowhere to look from. He simply stated, with the calm certainty of someone reporting an observed fact, first of all, chaos came to be. Tile. A historian's note. The precise nature of chaos has been debated for over 2,000 years. Some ancient commentators understood chaos as a divine being, a conscious entity of limitless depth. Others read it as a primordial condition, a state of pure potentiality rather than a person. What is remarkable is that both readings produce the same result, something older than personhood, older than consciousness, older than the question of whether something is alive or not. And yet, remarkably, almost tenderly, the ancient world did not fear chaos, the way we might expect. The void was not a villain. It was not a wound in reality to be healed or a darkness to be driven back. It was the womb, the source, the patient, waiting openness from which all things, given sufficient time, would inevitably pour. What is extraordinary about chaos is not what it was, but what it did simply by existing. Because existence, it turns out, has a kind of restlessness to it. Even a void, if left long enough, seems to want to fill itself. The ancient thinkers understood this, not as a mechanical process, not as particles colliding in an empty field, but as something almost like longing, as though the great gaping nothing ached, in whatever way a nothing can ache, to become something. And so it did. From chaos came Gaia, broad-breasted earth, the first solid thing, the first surface upon which anything could ever stand. And alongside Gaia, without delay and without explanation, came Tartarus, the sunless deep beneath the earth, and Eros, the binding force of creation itself. These did not emerge because chaos decided to create them. They arose because the void's infinite openness had at last collapsed under the weight of its own potential. They were not born so much as they were declared by the void, for the void, as the void's first and most decisive answer to itself. From chaos itself, separately, distinctly, as its own next breath, came two more beings. Erebus, the deep darkness that fills the underworld, the shadow between the roots of the world, and Nyx, the night, black-winged, drifting, incomprehensibly ancient even by the standards of the other primordials. We will sit with Nyx at length in the chapter that follows, because she deserves that time. But for now, simply know that she came from chaos, the way a thought comes from silence, naturally, inevitably, as if she had always been there, and the void had only just remembered to let her out. There is something here that the ancient Greeks understood with a clarity we rarely credit them for, something that modern physics, in its own language, has been quietly rediscovering for a century. The idea that nothing is never truly empty, that a void is not an absence of things, but a fullness of possibilities, all of them pressing against one another in the dark, waiting for the conditions that will allow one of them to become real. The Greeks did not have the mathematics for quantum fields or vacuum energy, but they had Hesiod. And Hesiod understood, in the way that poets sometimes understand things before the language for them exists, that the great chaos at the beginning of all things was not a dead end. It was a doorway. Everything that has ever existed, every mountain, every ocean, every empire, every evening, every sleeping child and dying star, walked through that door. It is still open, if you know how to be quiet enough to feel it. The earth that breathes, and the deep that has no bottom. Every culture that has ever existed upon this earth has, at some point, pressed a hand to the ground and felt something pressing back, not the coldness of soil, not the give of grass or the hardness of packed clay, but something older, something deliberate, a patience so deep it has no flaw, radiating upward through the roots and the rock, and the slow, dark miles of mantle, as if the earth itself were simply waiting for you to notice that it was aware of you all along. The ancient Greeks did not merely feel this and move on. They looked at it carefully, turned it over in their minds across centuries of thought, and arrived at a conclusion that was, in its way, more honest than almost anything we have said about the earth since. They concluded that this sense, this unsettling, persistent, wordless intimation that the ground is not simply beneath you, but is in some profound way attending to you, was not a feeling at all. It was a recognition. The earth was alive. Not metaphorically, not symbolically. The earth was a being. Vast, ancient, conscious in ways that no human vocabulary could fully approach. And her name was Gaia. We must be precise here, because the distinction matters enormously. Gaia was not a goddess of the earth. She was not a divine figure who looked after the earth, or presided over its seasons, or blessed its harvests. Those were functions that would, in time, pass to younger and more accommodating deities, to Demeter, to Persephone, to a whole generation of Olympians who were willing to manage, to negotiate, to work within the systems of prayer and sacrifice that human civilization required. Gaia required nothing. She preceded the concept of requirement. Gaia was the earth, the literal, physical, breathing totality of it. Her body was the ground. Her bones were the mountains. The rivers ran through her, the way blood runs through a sleeping person, steadily, without intention, simply because that is the nature of what she was. When Hesiod called her broad-breasted, he was not reaching for a poetic image. He was making a geological observation. She was the broad, flat, foundational surface upon which everything else rested, and she was conscious of every inch of it simultaneously. The way you are conscious of your own skin, she did not rule the earth. She was the earth. And the difference between those two things is the difference between a king and a continent. What followed from Gaia's emergence was one of the most extraordinary acts of creation in any mythology, anywhere in the world. Gaia, entirely on her own, without partner or precedent, generated from herself the starry sky. She called him Oranos, and he arched himself above her, covering her completely, fitting against her edges like a lid over a jar, and in the space between them, that narrow, intimate gap between earth below and sky above, The world as living things could know it became possible. She also generated, again alone, the mountains, not as landmarks or geographic features, but as her own raised and deliberate expression, joys unto herself. Hesiod says, dwelling places of the divine nymphs who haunted their clefts. She brought forth Pontos, the deep sea, not as a gift or an accident, but as another extension of herself. The water that surrounds the land being, in Gaia's understanding, no less a part of her body than the land itself. For generating life and form entirely without male counterpart was not, for the ancient Greeks, a miraculous exception to natural law. It was the original condition. The earliest layer of reality produced itself. Only later, as the world became more complex and more ordered, did the pattern of union and generation emerge. Gaia's solitary creativity was understood as the template upon which all subsequent creation was modeled. The first proof that existence, given sufficient depth and time, always finds a way to make more of itself, to cumber, and then, when Ouranos lay over her, and the two of them together began the slow generation of the Titans, the Cyclopes, and the terrible Hecatoncheires, the hundred-handed ones, something happened that reveals, more than any other single episode in Greek myth, just how different Gaia was from any deity that came after her. Ouranos, frightened by what his children might become, refused to let them be born. He pressed them back into Gaia, back into the earth itself, and kept them there, imprisoned within their own mother's body. And Gaia, who had held mountains since the beginning of time, who had generated seas from her own substance, and held the sky against herself for eons. Gaia groaned. It is one of the most quietly devastating details in all of ancient literature. The earth herself, in pain, not wounded by a weapon, not defeated by a superior force, simply laden beyond what even she, in her immensity, could bear without protest. She groaned, and then she acted. She fashioned a great sickle of grey flint, the first tool ever made, one might argue, since nothing had needed making before. And she asked her children, still trapped within her, which of them was willing to help her end what Ouranos was doing. Most of them said nothing. One spoke. The youngest of her Titan sons, Kronos, the one who would in time become the father of the Olympians, said simply, "I will do it." Gaia, the earth, handed her own child a blade from within her own body, and with it the age of the Primordials lurched for the first time towards something new. If Gaia is everything that can be stood upon, then Tartarus is everything that lies beneath the standing. He emerged from chaos alongside Gaia, one of the original four, arriving at the same moment that the void first chose to become something, and he was, in his essence, the answer to a question that the Earth's existence immediately posed. If there is a surface, said the logic of ancient cosmology, then there must be a depth. If there is a floor, there must be something below the floor. And below that, something further still. Tartarus was what you found if you kept going down long after every sensible person had stopped. The measure of Tartarus, as given by Hesiod. A bronze anvil, dropped from heaven, falls for 9 days and 9 nights before it strikes the earth. Dropped again from that same point on the earth, it falls for 9 more days and 9 more nights before it reaches Tartarus. He is, in other words, as far below the earth as the earth is below the sky. A mirror depth, a perfect inversion of everything above, hidden away beneath the world like a secret the ground has kept since the beginning. Hesiod's measurement reveals something fascinating. Tartarus is not simply a deep pit, he is a dimensional equivalent to the sky. He is as much beneath the world as the heavens are above it, making the earth itself a kind of midpoint. a narrow, inhabited seam between two vast and opposing absences, the one bright and open and the other dark and closed, both of them equally real, equally ancient, equally profound. In the architecture of the ancient Greek cosmos, Tartarus served as the ultimate prison, the place where things went when they could not simply be destroyed, because in a world this old, truly destroying something was nearly impossible. The Titans, after the Olympians overthrew them, were cast into Tartarus. The monstrous Typhon was buried beneath a mountain and driven down into its depths. The Cyclopes were imprisoned there by Ouranos himself, before Kronos freed them. Tartarus was where creation put its most dangerous contents when it needed them out of reach but could not, for whatever reason, make them cease to be. Tartarus was not a punishment invented for criminals. He was a fundamental feature of reality, a depth so absolute that even the gods, in their worst moments of fury, could find no sentence that went beyond it. But Tartarus was not only a prison, he was a being, a conscious, ancient, enormously powerful entity who lay beneath the world and was the world's deepest self in the same way that Gaia was its surface self. And in one of the most extraordinary unions in all of mythology, Gaia and Tartarus, surface and depth, top and bottom, everything that can be touched and everything that cannot, came together and produced a child. That child was Typhon, the last great monster of the Greek mythological tradition. The final challenge to Olympian authority, a creature so terrible that when he rose from the depths and moved against the gods, every single Olympian, including Zeus himself, fled in panic from the sight of him. He had 100 serpent heads, each one breathing fire, each one capable of producing a different and overwhelming sound, the bellowing of a bull, the roaring of a lion, the hiss of serpents, the bark of a dog. He was what happens when the earth and the abyss decide, just once, to work together. He was the surface and the depth, united, unmeasured, uncontainable. Zeus eventually defeated Typhon, hurling him back into Tartarus, pinning him beneath the volcanic island of Edna. But the effort nearly destroyed everything. The earth shook. The seas boiled. The ancient boundaries between the layers of the world, so carefully maintained since the beginning, threatened to collapse entirely into one another. It was the closest the ancient world ever came to ending. What Gaia and Tartarus give us, taken together, is something that the ancient Greeks understood about the structure of reality that is easy to miss if you only ever read the myths of the Olympians. The world, in the oldest Greek conception, was not a stage built for human drama. It was not a backdrop against which gods played out their stories. It was itself alive, itself a set of beings, itself full of intent and memory, and the capacity for grief and action and union. The ground beneath you breathes. The deep beneath the ground remembers. The sky that arches above you was generated by the same mother who holds you up. And she has been holding things up since before the concept of falling was invented. Gaia does not need your prayers. Tartarus does not need your fear. They existed before the language of prayer was spoken, and they will exist after the last word of it fades. They are the architecture. Everything else, every god, every hero, every dynasty, every civilization that has risen and crumbled and returned to the soil, is simply furniture arranged inside a house that was built before any of them arrived. And the house, as it has always been, is very much still standing. The night that even the gods did not dare anger. There is a moment, if you have ever been somewhere truly dark, not the managed dark of a bedroom with curtains drawn, not the soft dark of a city at 3 a.m, but the real dark, the absolute dark of a cave or a moonless field, far from any road. There is a moment, usually about 30 seconds in, when the dark stops feeling like the absence of light, and starts feeling like a presence of its own. It presses. It has weight. It seems, in some way, that you cannot quite defend to yourself in the morning, to be paying attention. The ancient Greeks would have told you that you were not imagining this. They would have told you that what you were feeling in that moment was Nyx, and they would have said it quietly and with great care, because even the telling of her name was something they did not take lightly. Nyx was the goddess of night, and she was among the very first beings to exist, emerging from chaos alongside Erebus, her companion darkness. In those first impossible moments when the void began, haltingly, to become a world. She is depicted in the ancient tradition as a figure of extraordinary, somber beauty, draped in dark robes or wrapped in a garment of stars, driving a chariot across the sky as day retreated before her. Black-winged, serene, utterly without urgency, because she knew, as all truly ancient things know, that she would always arrive eventually. But the image does not capture the reality. Images rarely do with Nyx. What made Nyx singular, what placed her in a category that even the other Primordials did not quite occupy, was the nature of the authority she carried. Not political authority, not divine authority in the sense of temples and worship and the obligation of lesser beings to obey. Something older and stranger than that. Something closer to the authority of a natural law. You do not obey gravity because it is powerful. You obey it because it is prior to your existence, and the rules of reality were written before your preferences were consulted. Nyx was prior. She was prior to the gods, prior to the order they enforced, prior to the contracts and agreements and cosmic arrangements that held the Olympian world together, and every being in that world, from the lowest shade in the underworld to the highest and most thunderous Olympian, understood this in the wordless way that creatures understand things that are true before they are taught. When Zeus pursued the god Hypnos for putting him to sleep against his will, Hypnos fled to his mother. Zeus, arriving at her threshold, stopped. He turned back. He would not risk her anger, not because she could destroy him, but because her displeasure would be a thing older than destruction itself. This episode, preserved in the Iliad and one of the most telling passages in all of Homer, deserves to be read slowly. Zeus was at the height of his power. He had overthrown his father, imprisoned the Titans, defeated Typhon, and established the order of the Olympians over the whole of creation. He had thrown mountains at enemies and struck them with lightning from a sky that was entirely his own. He was, by every measure the ancient world possessed, the most powerful being then in active dominion over the cosmos. And he stopped at Nyx's door. He did not challenge her. He did not argue his case. He simply stopped, turned around, went back. Because there are things in this world older than power, and power, if it is genuinely intelligent, knows better than to pretend otherwise. A historian's note. The philosopher Aristophanes, writing considerably later, placed Nyx at the very origin of all things, even before chaos in some accounts, describing her as laying the primordial egg from which Eros hatched, beginning the great generative chain of existence across the ancient world, in Orphic hymns, in philosophical cosmologies, in the traditions of Asia Minor and beyond. Night occupied this role of absolute precedent. She was the thing before the first thing, the breath before the first breath. Nyx made her home at the very edge of the world, in a palace of clouds and deep darkness beyond the reach of the sun. There she dwelled with her daughter Hemera, Day, and the two of them lived in a careful, perpetual alternation, one entering as the other departed, never sharing the threshold, never meeting. Each morning, Nyx drew her dark robes back across the world's far horizon and stepped inside as Hemera stepped out. Each evening, the exchange reversed. They passed one another in the doorway of the same house, and kept the rhythm of the world going without being required to speak. It is one of the most quietly beautiful arrangements in all of ancient cosmology, and it tells us something important. Night and day, in the Greek understanding, were not opposites locked in conflict. They were sisters sharing a home, taking turns, maintaining between them the most fundamental rhythm any living thing has ever known. If Nyx was the night that falls across the surface of the world each evening, then Erebus was the darkness that never moves and never lifts. The permanent, structural dark that fills the spaces light has never reached and never will. He was the shadow not of objects, but of reality itself. The deep dark of the underworld, the lightlessness between the roots of mountains, the blackness at the bottom of the sea where no sun has ever reached and where nothing that lives at the surface could survive. Erebus and Nyx were companions from the beginning, both children of chaos, both among the original beings, both made of the same essential material of cosmic darkness, but expressing it in different registers. Where Nyx moved, Erebus was still. Where Nyx was temporal, arriving, departing, cyclical, Erebus was permanent. He did not come and go, he simply was, in all the places where the alternative had never been an option. Together, Nyx and Erebus produced children, and it is in this list of offspring that the true scope of what these two beings represented becomes fully clear. The children of Nyx and Erebus. The concepts that walk in the dark. Hypnos. Sleep, the twin brother of death, gentlest of all the dark children, who drifts above the earth each night, scattering poppies. Thanatos. Death, not violent death, but the quiet, inevitable kind. The soft unclenching, the final exhale. Eris. Discord, the friction that lives in every relationship, every nation, every moment. A choice must be made between competing goods. Nemesis. Retribution, the righting force, the correction that follows excess as inevitably as night follows day. Moros. Doom, not a punishment, but the simple fact that everything has its end already written into its beginning. Vicares. Violent death and disease, the dark sisters who gathered on the edges of battlefields and fed on the fallen. Oases, misery and anxiety, the low, cold dread that settles in before the mind can name why it is afraid. Apate. Deception, the original deceiver, older than any god who ever lied, born of night because falsehood thrives in darkness. Geras. Old age, the slow dimming, the gradual loosening of the world's grip, the tide going out. Momus. Blame and criticism, the voice that finds the flaw in everything, even perfection, even the gods themselves. Velotes. Affection, the tenderness born of darkness, the closeness that comes only in the quiet hours. The one eroi. Dreams, the whole multitude of them, good and false and inexplicable, released each night from their cavern at the world's edge. Pause here for a moment and simply look at that list. Sleep and death, discord and doom, deception and misery, old age, retribution, blame, dreams, affection. These are not characters in a story. They are the fundamental forces that shape every human life from its first hour to its last. The invisible architecture of what it means to be conscious and mortal and alive in a world that does not adjust its workings to your preferences. And every single one of them was born of night. Every one of them came from Nyx. She did not invent these things. She gave birth to them, which means they were already inside her, waiting, which means that darkness had always contained them, which means that the night is not empty at all. This is the revelation that the myth of Nyx is actually trying to deliver beneath its narrative surface. It is not simply saying that bad things happen at night, or that darkness is dangerous, or that we should fear the dark. It is saying something far more precise and far more interesting. that all of the deepest and most consequential forces of human experience, not just the frightening ones, but also sleep, dreams, tenderness, the correction of injustice, are children of the oldest darkness. They arose from the same primordial source as everything else. They are not aberrations in an otherwise orderly cosmos. They are foundational. They belong. The ancient Greeks did not build a theology that tried to eliminate darkness or overcome it. They built one that tried to understand it, to name its children, to know what walked in it and why. And in doing so, they arrived at something that is, in its quiet way, enormously consoling. The dark is not empty. It is full of things that have names, and many of those things, sleep, dreams, the closeness that comes in the quiet hours, the slow settling of old grievances, are not to be feared at all. In the great palace at the edge of the world, Nyx does not sleep. She does not need to. She draws her robes back from the morning sky and steps inside, and the door closes, and she waits with the patience of something that was ancient, before patience had a name. Her daughter Hemera steps out into the light. The world begins again. The dreams that came in the night disperse back through the twin gates of horn and ivory, the true ones and the false ones tangling together as they always have, as they always will. And somewhere, in the places too deep for light to find, in the long dark under the mountains, in the silence below, the silence at the bottom of the sea, Erebus holds still, as he has always held still, as he will always hold still, because some darknesses are not temporary, and some absences are not waiting to be filled. They are simply the other half of what the world is, whole, permanent, and entirely at peace with what they are, the oldest love, the oldest water, and the gravity that holds all things together. There is a version of love, but is older than any story ever told about it, older than the first poem scratched into clay, older than the first two people who looked at one another across a fire and felt the world narrow to that single point of light between them. This version of love does not begin with a person. It does not begin with desire or longing or the particular ache of recognizing something in another that you had not known was missing from yourself. It begins much earlier than any of that. It begins at the beginning, which is to say, it begins before the beginning, because the beginning, it turns out, could not have happened without it. The ancient Greeks called it Eros, and they were very careful when they were being precise about their cosmology to distinguish this Eros from the younger, more familiar god of the same name, the winged boy with his arrows, the mischief maker, the companion of Aphrodite. That Eros came much later in the myths of the Olympian age, and was a charming and sometimes dangerous figure, but essentially a personal one, a god of romantic entanglement, a being whose concerns were fundamentally human in scale. The primordial Eros had no arrows. He had no wings, no mischief, no particular interest in the romantic difficulties of mortals or gods. He was something so much larger than any of that, it barely qualifies as the same concept at all. When Hesiod placed Eros among the very first four beings, alongside Chaos, Gaia, and Tartarus, he was not making a statement about romance. He was making a statement about physics, about the fundamental structure of a universe that had just, in those first impossible moments, begun to exist. Because here is the problem that the emergence of Gaia from chaos immediately created. You have a void. The void becomes something, becomes earth, becomes depth, begins to differentiate itself into distinct things with distinct natures. But what holds them together? What prevents the newly formed fabric of reality from simply drifting? What is the force that says, this goes here, this belongs with that? These two things are in relation to one another, and that relation is the beginning of structure. Eros is the answer. Eros was not born because the universe needed tenderness. He was born because without the force of attraction, Without something that draws thing to thing, creation could not have held its own shape for a single moment. He is described by Hesiod as the most beautiful among the immortal gods, limb-loosening, overwhelming, the one who subdues the mind and the thoughtful counsel of all gods and all men. But this language, which sounds at first like the language of romantic love, is actually the language of cosmological power. Limb-loosening, overwhelming, mind-subduing. These are not descriptions of a pleasant feeling. They are descriptions of a force that is simply larger than the individual experiencing it. A force that operates on you regardless of your preferences, that reorganizes your priorities without asking permission, that makes the distance between two things intolerable in a way that only the dissolution of that distance can resolve. This is gravity, essentially. This is magnetism. This is the strong nuclear force that holds the centers of atoms together against all the pressure that would otherwise tear them apart. The ancient Greeks did not have these terms, but they had eros, and they understood, with the kind of knowledge that arrives before the vocabulary for it exists, that without some binding force at the root of reality, nothing would have remained coherent long enough to become anything at all. A historian's note. The Orphic tradition, a distinct strain of ancient Greek religious thought that produced its own cosmological accounts, placed Eros in an even more exalted position than Hesiod. In Orphic cosmology, Eros was the first being to emerge from the primordial egg that Nyx laid in the darkness before the world existed, and it was Eros who set all of creation in motion, who caused the first separations and the first unions, who was, in the most literal possible sense, the engine of existence. Different traditions, different emphases, but the same irreducible point. Without Eros, nothing moves toward anything else. Without attraction, there is no universe. There is only an infinite and permanent isolation of parts that never find one another. And so the world held together. Gaia reached upward and generated Ouranos to arch above her. Tartarus reached his vast depth downward into the foundations of things. The stars found their places and kept them. The seas spread across the surface of the earth and stayed. Structure persisted. Complexity accumulated. Life, eventually, in its patient and extraordinary way, became possible. All of it held in place by the oldest and most fundamental of all, the primordial forces. The simple, cosmic, inescapable fact that things are drawn toward other things, and that this drawing is not a weakness or a vulnerability, but the very mechanism by which anything beautiful has ever been built. When Gaia, in her first great act of solitary creation, brought forth the sea, when she generated from her own body the vast salt water that would come to cover more than 2/3 of the world's surface, that would be the highway and the barrier and the mystery and the grave of every seafaring civilization that ever existed. She was not generating a body of water. She was giving birth to a person. His name was Pontos, and he was the primeval sea in the same sense that Gaia was the primeval earth. Not a god who commanded the sea, not a divine figure who lived within it or ruled over it, but the sea itself, made conscious, made ancient, given a name. Hesiod describes him without great elaboration. Pontos, the barren sea with its raging swell, and this restraint is itself revealing. There is no throne, no court, no catalogue of deeds and adventures. Pontos simply is. He is the oldest water. He was here before Poseidon and his trident, before Oceanus and his river encircling the world, before every sea god and nymph and nereid that the Greek imagination ever produced. He was the original ocean. And the original ocean is not interested in your mythology. It was doing what it does long before mythology arrived to describe it, where the Olympian sea gods were personalized, characterized, embroiled in the politics of gods and men. Poseidon with his earthquakes and his grudges, Oceanus with his cosmic river and his careful neutrality. Pontos occupied none of that. He was the sea at its most essential, formless, borderless, ancient, and indifferent to the dramas playing out upon his surface. He did not hate sailors. He did not love them either. He simply continued, as the sea has always continued, whether there were ships upon him or not. What Pontos gave the world beyond the sea itself was a lineage of extraordinary beings. For when he and Gaia came together, the union of the oldest land and the oldest water, they produced children of a kind that no subsequent generation of gods would quite replicate. Their son, Nereus, the old man of the sea, was the original sea deity, a being of perfect honesty and ancient wisdom, who could take any shape and who never lied, in a world where the capacity for deception was increasingly common currency. Their daughter Thamus was wonder itself, the divine personification of the marvelous strangeness of the sea, the father in turn of the rainbow goddess Iris and of the storm wind spirits, the Harpies. And then there was Phorcys and Ceto, two of the most fascinating and unsettling of Pontos' children, who between them produced a lineage of sea monsters and terrible beings that would haunt the nightmares of Greek sailors for 1,000 years. The Gorgons, whose gaze turned men to stone. Scylla, the grey eye, the grey sisters who shared a single eye and a single tooth between three ancient bodies. Ladon, the serpent who coiled around the roots of the world. All of them were grandchildren of Pontos, children of the first water, and all of them carried within their terrible natures something of the sea's own essence, beauty that kills, depth that cannot be sounded, and a perfect, alien indifference to the fate of anything foolish enough to come too close. The monsters did not come from nowhere. They came from the sea, and the sea, from the very beginning, had always been a person, ancient, vast, and only distantly concerned with the preferences of the things that lived upon its shores. There is a thread running between Eros and Pontos that is easy to miss if you look at them individually, as discrete mythological figures, rather than as part of the same cosmological argument. Eros is the force of attraction, the principle that draws things toward one another, that makes isolation intolerable and union generative. Pontos is the sea, the vast, borderless medium that connects every shore to every other shore, that makes the world continuous rather than fragmented, that ensures that no land is truly isolated as long as the water between them can be crossed. They are, in different registers, the same idea. They are both about the impossibility of permanent separation. They are both about the deep, structural insistence of the universe that things shall not remain forever apart. The ancient world understood this more viscerally than we do, because the ancient world depended on the sea in a way that we, with our roads and our aircraft and our undersea cables, no longer quite feel. The Mediterranean was not a barrier between civilizations. It was their shared tissue. Greek culture spread along it the way a thought spreads along a nerve. Ideas, art, religion, language, the shapes of letters and the names of gods, all of it moved across Pontos, carried on wooden ships, stitched together by the fact that water, unlike land, does not hold borders. You cannot build a wall across the sea. The sea refuses to be divided. It connects, always, everything that touches it. The ancient voices on Eros, Hesiod called Eros, the most beautiful of the immortal gods, the one who loosens the limbs of all gods and all men, who overcomes their mind and their thoughtful counsel within their breasts. Parmenides, the pre-Socratic philosopher, placed Eros first among the gods, the first cause, the original mover, the being whose existence made all subsequent existence possible by making things capable of reaching toward one another. Plato, in the Symposium, has Phaedrus call Eros the oldest of the gods, the one responsible for the greatest goods, because it is love, in its deepest and most original sense, that moves people toward excellence toward courage, toward the willingness to sacrifice for something beyond themselves. Aristophanes placed Eros not merely at the beginning of time, but as the mechanism of time itself, the force without which the chain of cause and effect could never have begun, because without attraction, nothing would ever have caused anything else. What this chorus of ancient voices is collectively saying is something that the modern world has largely parceled out into separate disciplines: physics, chemistry, psychology, sociology, and in doing so has perhaps lost the ability to say as a single, unified thought. The Greeks held it as one thought. They held it in the figure of Eros. The force that holds atoms together is the same force that holds civilizations together. The gravity that keeps planets in their orbits is the same force, expressed in a different register, as the love that keeps a family in the same house across generations of difficulty. Connection, at every scale from the subatomic to the cosmic, is one thing. It has always been one thing. And its oldest name, its truest name, the name it had before any of the others, is Eros. So we have now a cosmos. We have a void that gave birth to a world. We have an earth that is conscious, and a depth that is bottomless, and a darkness that goes about its work with quiet, ancient authority every time the sun goes down. We have the force that holds it all together, and the water that refuses to let any part of it remain permanently separate from any other part. We have, in other words, everything, or very nearly, because there is one chapter left, and it is perhaps the most quietly sorrowful of all, the chapter in which all of this extraordinary primordial machinery begins, slowly, to recede, not to disappear, never to disappear, but to step back, to let something newer and louder and more immediately human take the foreground, while the primordials do what the oldest things have always done. They withdraw into the foundations. They become the ground upon which everything else is built. They become so fundamental that they stop being noticed, which is, for a being of sufficient age and depth, perhaps the closest thing to peace that existence can offer. The age of the Olympians is coming, but the age of the primordials never truly ends. It simply goes quiet and waits. How the oldest beings became the ground beneath everything else. Every civilization, as it grows more organized and more confident in its own structures, does the same thing to the forces that preceded it. It does not destroy them. Destruction would require acknowledging that they were powerful enough to warrant it. Instead, it does something quieter and more effective. It renames them. It shrinks them. It reassigns their portfolios to younger, more biddable figures who fit more neatly into the new hierarchies, who have faces and families and personality, who can be prayed to and bargained with and worked around. And it places the original forces, the older, vaster, less convenient ones, into the deep background of its mythology, where they continue to exist, acknowledged but no longer centered, like the original beams of a house hidden now behind plaster and paint. This is what the Greek world did to the primordials, and it is one of the most fascinating and most human things that the ancient world ever did. The transition did not happen all at once. It happened in layers, across centuries, as the Greek mythological tradition evolved from its oldest roots. Those bare, enormous cosmological statements of Hesiod toward the richer, more personalized, more narratively complex world of Homer, of the tragic playwrights, of Pindar and Ovid, and the whole vast flowering of classical literature that followed. In the beginning, as we have seen, the world was held by beings who were the world. Gaia was not a character in a story, she was the ground. Nyx was not a figure who appeared in episodes, she was the dark itself. Eros was not a participant in mythological drama, he was the binding force that made drama, that made anything at all possible. These beings were too large, too structural, too fundamental to be protagonists. A story needs an event, a choice, a consequence. You cannot write a scene in which the earth decides to do something, because the earth is always already doing everything, and has been since before the concept of a scene existed. And so the stories needed new figures, more immediate figures, gods who were vast in power, but finite in personality, who had preferences and prejudices, who could be angry or generous or deceitful or just, who could be approached, appealed to, and occasionally outwitted by a sufficiently clever mortal. The Titans came first, a kind of intermediate generation, still cosmic in scale but already more individual, already more storied. And then the Olympians arrived, and the world of Greek mythology became, almost overnight, a world of extraordinary narrative richness and complexity. Zeus seized the sky. Poseidon took the sea. Demeter presided over the harvest that grew from Gaia's body. They divided among 12 bright personalities what had previously belonged, undivided, to beings too ancient for division to apply to them. But notice what this division required. It required that the sea become a kingdom with a ruler, rather than a person in its own right. It required that the earth's fertility become a portfolio managed by a goddess, rather than the natural expression of Gaia's own immeasurable life. It required that the night become something that a torch could push back, rather than a being whose threshold even the king of the gods would not cross in anger. The world became, in a very real sense, more manageable, more human in scale, more amenable to the kind of stories that humans needed to tell themselves in order to feel that the cosmos was, if not kind, at least navigable. This was not a failure of imagination. It was an act of civilization. Human beings, as they build their societies and their temples and their systems of meaning, require a mythology that reflects the scale at which they live, not the scale at which the universe operates. The Primordials operated at the scale of the universe. The Olympians operated at the scale of human experience. And it was the Olympians who, for 3,000 years of Western culture, captured the imagination of every poet, sculptor, philosopher, and playwright who reached for the sacred, Tema. A historian's note, what is remarkable and worth pausing on is how carefully the Greek tradition preserved the primordials, even as it superseded them. Hesiod did not erase them. He placed them with great precision at the foundation of the entire cosmological account. Homer nodded to them in passing. Nyx at Zeus's door, Gaia called upon in oaths of the most binding kind, Tartarus named as the ultimate depth of consequence. The Romans translated them wholesale into their own tradition. The Orphics built entire theological systems around their primacy. The philosophers used them as starting points for arguments about the nature of reality. They faded from the center of worship, yes, but they were never forgotten, because the Greek world understood, at some bedrock level, that you cannot forget the foundation without risking the whole structure above it. There is a particular kind of legacy that belongs only to things that are old enough and fundamental enough to have become invisible. The primordials left behind something stranger and more durable than temples, stranger and more durable than myths, stranger even than the philosophical traditions that grew from thinking carefully about what they meant. They left behind the world itself. Gaia is still here. She has not gone anywhere. She has not retired. Every earthquake is still her body adjusting. Every mountain range is still her expression. Every seed that breaks open in the dark soil is still, in the most literal sense, something happening inside her. We have given her different names across different centuries. The biosphere, the ecosystem, the living planet, the climate system, and we have surrounded her with the language of science, which is the language of measurability and mechanism. But the thing itself, the ancient, patient, conscious-seeming aliveness of the world beneath our feet, is unchanged. Gaia continues. She simply no longer has worshippers who know her name. Nyx continues to. Every evening, without ceremony and without fail, she does what she has always done. She does not require acknowledgement. The dark arrives, whether you name it or not, whether you fear it or have learned, over the course of a long life, to find in it the same things her ancient children always were. Rest, dreams, the particular tenderness of hours that belong to no one, the slow settling of the day's accumulated weight. Hypnos still comes to you every night, and you still, every night, surrender to him without a word. Thanatos will come eventually to every one of us, and will do so with the same quiet courtesy he has always brought to the task. Not as punishment, not as failure, but as the soft and ancient completion of a finite thing. Eros has not loosened his grip for a single moment since the beginning of time. You feel him every time you are drawn toward something, toward a person, toward a piece of music, toward an idea that will not leave you alone, toward a landscape that stops you mid-step with its unreasonable beauty. You feel him in the way atoms hold themselves together, in the way the moon pulls the ocean, in the way a tree's roots reach blindly through the dark soil toward water they have never seen but somehow know is there. He is, as he has always been, the reason that nothing in this universe is willing to remain permanently alone. And Tartarus, the abyss beneath everything, is still there, still waiting. Still as deep as the sky is high. Still the place where the things that cannot be destroyed go to be contained, in the permanent dark, at the bottom of a distance that no light has ever crossed, and no map has ever charted. We live in an age that is, in many ways, the most powerful human civilization has ever produced. We have instruments that can see to the edge of the observable universe. We have theories that describe the behavior of particles so small they have no meaningful size at all. We have mapped the genome, split the atom, walked on the moon, and built machines that can, with reasonable competence, discuss ancient mythology at 3 a.m. We have, by almost any measurable standard, answered more questions about the nature of reality than every previous generation of human beings combined. And yet, the night still arrives without asking our permission. The ground still holds us up without requiring our gratitude. The sea still connects every shore to every other shore and refuses, as it has always refused, to be divided by the lines we draw on maps. We're still drawn, helplessly and without full explanation, toward the people and the places and the ideas that matter most to us. We still sleep. We still dream. We are still, each of us, going to die. Quietly, inevitably, with whatever grace we can manage, and return at last to the earth that has been waiting for us since before we were born. The Primordials did not invent these things. They did not impose them upon us. They simply were these things, long before we existed to experience them, and they will continue to be these things, long after the last human civilization has concluded its extraordinary, brief, and luminous experiment. They are not mythological in the sense of being untrue. They are mythological in the deepest and most precise sense of the word. They are the oldest stories that the human mind reached for when it tried to account for the things that are most fundamental about the world. And those things have not changed. The dark is still full of what Nyx placed in it. The ground is still alive in the way that Gaia was always alive. The force that holds everything together has been holding everything together since the first moment something existed to be held. And somewhere beneath the world, beneath every possible world, Tartarus waits with the patience of something that has never needed to hurry, because it has always known that eventually everything comes down to it in the end. There is a practice in some contemplative traditions of sitting very still and very quiet until the noise of the immediate world, the obligations, the anxieties, the relentless, small urgencies of a human life, begins gradually to recede, until you can feel beneath all of it something older, something that was there before you arrived and will be there after you leave. Something that holds you up without knowing your name and keeps the dark at bay each morning without any instruction from you at all. The ancient Greeks had a word for the feeling of standing in the presence of something that exceeded all human scale. They called it awe, and they understood, as all genuinely wise traditions understand, that awe is not a pleasant emotion in the way that happiness is pleasant. It is larger than pleasant. It is the feeling of the self becoming appropriately small in the presence of something appropriately vast. Not diminished, but correctly proportioned, which is its own kind of relief. The primordials are where that feeling comes from. They are the oldest objects of awe in the human record, older than any temple, older than any prayer, older than the first word ever spoken into the dark, in the hope that something was listening. They are the things that were here when we arrived. Who were here, in fact, since before the concept of arriving had been invented, and they are still here now, doing what they have always done, holding everything up with the calm and immeasurable patience of the truly, irreducibly ancient. We did not build this world, we simply arrived in it, and the beings who were here when we arrived are still here now, doing what they have always done, holding everything up with the calm and immeasurable patience of the truly, irreducibly ancient. The earth beneath you breathes. The dark above you watches. The force that holds you here has been holding things here since before here was a place. Rest in that, for a moment if you can. Let it be as large as it is. It has been waiting a very long time for you to notice it.